Hello, everybody. We're going to start on our third session on the agreement of sale. We're doing a really good deep dive here. Today, we're going to start with um, the due diligence menu and do a deep dive on that. And then we're going to get done with this so we can move on to other exciting contracts. All right. Any questions or anything that anybody really wants me to dive into as we enter session three on the agreement of sale? Just a reminder, anybody in the room have their Maryland license or anybody at home?
I
If you
do.
watch this before tomorrow, same time tomorrow, our Maryland broker, Jenny McAtee, is going to do a dive into contracts and scenarios on Maryland forms. I know. If you can't get enough excitement out of the Pennsylvania forms, you can join us tomorrow for Maryland. Hard to believe we have all this excitement. Okay, I'm going to get into the sharing bit of this. So, hearing no directives, we're going to go right here. Please shout out your questions. It makes this more tolerable for everybody. All right. So we started talking briefly last time about the buyer's due diligence and inspections. I call this the menu, the due diligence menu. We talked about rights and responsibilities really briefly. We wrapped up with line 347. So right before the home inspection contingency, can anybody tell us what some of the takeaways were for the introductory paragraphs A, B, and C of paragraph 12, the buyer's due diligence menu? Did anybody have anything that really struck them out of that? Jonathan Reynolds just joined us. Hello, John. Uh, just keep in mind that the seller will provide access to insurers' representatives. That's super important. And another big part of this is um, the fact that we have to have all heating uh, and all utilities on for all those inspections and appraisals. Has anybody gotten to the pre-settlement walkthrough and we had our seller had already transferred service, so we didn't have the heat on for one reason or another at closing, or the water. Surely somebody here with all these KG veterans can tell me about a scenario where they went to do a pre-settlement walkthrough and they didn't have all the utilities on. Hey, Mindy, how you doing?
I'm good.
Good. Um, I know I've done pre-settlement walkthroughs and I probably get during the winter a call a month from an agent who says, "Hey, I'm at the pre-settlement walkthrough. The seller changed over the utilities and settlement didn't happen. The buyer didn't put in their name. The electricity's out. What do we do?" I am telling you to delay closing until we can get those utilities on. Um, because it's much easier to delay closing by a day or 48 hours than it is to figure out who pays for the frozen pipes or a non-functional furnace, which could be a 10 or a $15,000 repair. It's always better to be safe than sorry, and I think that had to do the coming about of that saying had to do specifically with this. I mean, this is so important, guys. So I really say pay attention to that one. Do your pre-settlement walkthroughs um, to close out this transaction and really close the book on it. Um, okay, so where we finished up last time we met was line 347. Uh, so paragraph C here, for elected inspections, the buyer will, within the contingency period stated in paragraph 13A, complete the inspection, obtain any inspection reports for results or results, and accept the property, terminate this agreement, or submit a written corrective proposal. So what's the time frame? The time frame is the time frame that's identified in paragraph 13A, being right here, your contingency period. So if we have not specified something other, that's a 10 days. And what do we do in that 10 days? This always causes a lot of people confusion. Um, Usually not our agents, usually agents on the other side who say, I got the report done in 10 days. Here it is, day 12, and here's our written corrective proposal. No, no, that had to be within the 10 days, right? So we'll talk more about timeframes when we get down to paragraph 13A. Let's talk about the home and property inspections. Um, we did cover last session that the buyer waives or elects specifically each of these inspections. Okay. Not the right to make it contingent upon the inspection, which it is, but it's the right to actually conduct the inspection. So if we waive the radon inspection, we don't have the right to conduct the radon inspection. So let's talk about the home and property inspection. What can we do during a home inspection? The buyer may conduct an inspection of the property's structural components, the roof, the exterior windows and exterior doors, building materials, fascia, gutters, downspouts, just everything that you can imagine, right? If the buyer elects to have a home inspection, it goes on to say here in line 354, a home inspection of the property as defined in the home inspection law. The home inspection must be performed by a full member in good standing of a National Home Inspection Association or a person supervised by a full member of a National Home Inspection Association in accordance with the ethical standards and code of conduct or practice of that association, or by a properly licensed or registered engineer or architect. So, what constitutes a home inspection as defined by the home inspection law? Anybody? Anybody?
Doesn't it have to be a licensed home inspector or somebody that works for a home inspection company or some kind of
It,
professional like heating guy or something like that?
yes, that's correct. But what constitutes a home inspection? Who, so I can call my electrician to inspect the electrical system. I can call my plumber to inspect the plumbing. But can I call, if I'm having one person inspect uh, more than one of those systems, there's supposed to be a licensed home inspector and
Insured?
insured. Um, but I'm not supposed to have my Uncle Lou come in and just do a walkthrough. Okay? That is in place to keep my Uncle Lou from coming in and saying that this house needs um, 14 items, um, that he doesn't have any real licensing ability. Or just because he's a licensed electrician, Uncle Lou can't come in and blow holes in this house for somebody. They want to make sure that there's a ethical standard upheld here. Does that make sense? Now, wood infest, when you elect the home or property inspection, what do you generally see on that home inspection? You'll have a 42-page report with color pictures, big red arrows pointing at different items. And There's going to be red letter items. What's the red letter items usually? And there's different formats. The ones that I think we're most familiar with and are most effective are the ones with pictures as opposed to the ones without pictures. I like the ones that have the red letter items, which denote that this is a more of an immediate concern. And then there's blue letter items for items that should be watched or monitored or may be an ongoing maintenance concern. Everybody familiar with those general formats?
Yep.
You're probably also familiar with the language employed by home inspectors, which says seek further evaluation, because these guys are generalists, right? And they're going to say, this doesn't meet, a particular standard, but they're not the ones practicing in the field every day. They are generally aware of electrical code and practice, and they're generally aware of what should be serviced or, um, a gas line should be bonded to the electrical system to prevent arcing and explosion, right? But they're not specialists in wiring or plumbing or other stuff. And they want you as a buyer to go out and have somebody who's professional in that field come in. Because one thing that a home inspector is also not supposed to do is tell you what that cost to repair is. And home inspectors are generally there to draw your attention to stuff, to material defects, but we don't want them as a profession to be alarmists, but we don't want them to gloss over stuff either because they serve us on both sides as listing agents and buyers agents. So that's their job, is to call out items of or areas of concern, and then it's the buyer's job to further investigate those. Now, wood infestation. What's included in wood destroying insect infestation inspections? All kinds of stuff. Carpenter bees, powder post beetles, termites. Um, are these an important thing? Yes, they are an important thing, because a lot of times people don't know what they're looking at, and this damage can be pervasive and it can be very expensive. My first house um, had a home inspection. Home inspection. They called in their wood destroying insect inspector and they missed the termites. Fast forward about 2 weeks and I'm standing there with a chainsaw. I cut the back of my house off because it was bug eaten. It was a blessing in disguise. I got to put an addition on the back of the house. And I'm okay with these kind of risks. How many buyers would be upset by that? I would say all of them. So for for 100 or $125, a wood infestation inspection is probably the cheapest peace of mind you can get. Now, what happens if you waive the wood destroying insect inspection and the home inspector calls out wood destroying insect damage? Has anybody ever had that occur? The home inspector is walking through the basement and says, "Hey, I'm not here for a termite inspection, but that's termite damage." That's nothing that we can hide. I think we have to act on that. Okay, guys? Just because we haven't elected the right to do that inspection, I think that that has to come into the conversation. Everybody hear me?
Yes.
Great. Deeds, restrictions, and zoning. How often do you elect this? Anybody ever?
Nope.
You know when you should. Um, this is a very useful one. Deeds, restrictions, and zoning. The buyer may investigate, and here's why, may investigate easements, deed and use restrictions, including historic preservation restrictions and ordinances that may apply to the property, and review local zoning ordinances. The buyer may verify that the present use of the property is permitted and may elect to make the agreement contingent upon an anticipated use, but you don't have to. All right. You just want to make sure that you understand what's going on with more than the physical property, but what you're allowed to do with the property. If there is an easement disclosed, I recommend considering electing this so that you can fully examine that easement. I have a property that's closing next Thursday. Um, I elected this contingency because there was a stormwater management system installed on the property, and I suspected that there was going to be restrictions to the use of the property because of that stormwater management system. Meaning, I wasn't sure that they were going to be able to put in the fence that they wanted or the shed that they wanted. If you've got somebody that you're showing a property and they say, hey, I would really like to build a garage back here. I'm only going to buy this if I can build a garage. That's when you check this deeds restrictions and zoning block, because you want to make sure that the setbacks allow that, that there's no drainage easement on the property, that there's no driveway serving another property behind it that you weren't aware of. And if there is an easement checked in the disclosure, you as a buyer's agent should be aware of that. And I would, you're doing your best service to your client by pointing out that that easement is disclosed in the seller's property disclosure, and then you're going to help them to discover what the real limitations of that easement are. Has anybody ever had any other interactions with that? Okay. Water service. Water service is super simple, right? I say water service if, the buyer may obtain an inspection of the quality and quantity of the water system for a properly licensed or otherwise qualified water or well testing company, if any, if and as required by the inspection company. The seller at the seller's expense will locate and provide access to the on-site or individual water system. A lot of people don't think about wells and some of the things that can go along with them. If anything at all is disclosed in the seller's property disclosure about that well going dry or anything like that, I could practically insist that you should really investigate that with a well company. Not just testing the potability of the water, but the supply of the water, because it's in the ground. This is one of the hardest things for us to quantify. We turn on the spigot and water comes out, and we assume that it's okay. They test it to make sure that it doesn't have chemicals in it, and we just assume that we're good. However, if that well goes dry, we have a major problem on our hands. What's it cost to replace a well? Anybody had that fun?
I bet you it's like 15,000. Wouldn't you think?
Well, the cheapest well I've ever replaced was $9,000, and we are dealing with one right now. One of our buyers bought one, and the well went dry, and it wound up being $35,000 to drill a new well. And it only marginally increased the flow.
Were they in the house whenever the well went dry? Or was it prior to closing?
They were in the house.
For how long?
Couple of weeks.
Wow. Ugh, I would throw up.
And then we had another one where we represented the seller. They disclosed that their well went dry on 2 occasions. And the well went dry about a year and a half after them selling the property. And now the buyers are suing them for that. That's why you use Seller Shield. So, water service can also be used on municipal systems. However, those municipal systems generally provide for, um, the water quality, usually on a quarterly basis. They're going to send out reports. Um, I have no problems with my water quality here in Carlisle, but it's hard, right? It's hard water. If somebody has particular sensitivities and doesn't like hard water, you could test for the quality here on a municipal system, and you could negotiate on that basis if you wanted. But the big one is definitely on the well. And if you ever run into a situation, please call me. I'll happily walk you through that, but keep your eye on those seller's property disclosures for hints that there may be water flow issues. Radon. Your buyer may obtain a radon test of the property. Um, what's the highest radon reading that you've ever encountered? Anybody?
I
I've
think I
seen,
had it.
oh, go ahead, you first.
Oh, I was just gonna say I think I had 26 one time.
I went to a property that the disclosure stated 39.
Wow.
Yeah, like we shouldn't be here long. So,
In Chambersburg, had one that was 88.
oh my gosh.
And there's areas, I think it really is prevalent in very shaly areas. Um, well, I guess it has to do, what is radon, first of all?
It's a gas,
That comes from,
rock, ground.
yep, it's a radioactive gas that's produced as a naturally occurring byproduct of the degrading of radioactive minerals in bedrock. And how's it get into our house? It comes up everywhere, right? It comes up under me, it comes up under you, it comes up outside my house. And if it comes up in the yard, sunlight hits it, it dissipates instantly. It's harmless. Becomes a problem whenever it comes up through cracks in our foundation, collects in the home, and it gets trapped there. Then it attaches to particulates in the air, settles into your lungs, becomes, according to some authorities, the second leading cause of lung cancer in the state of Pennsylvania. Um, how they track that, I don't know, but that's what they say. So, how do you, as I describe to my clients, it's the perfect product. You can't see it, smell it, or taste it, and it costs about $1,000 to get rid of it. So, how do you get rid of it, guys?
Ventilation.
Irrigation system.
Right. They call that sub-slab ventilation. They drill a hole and they pump it out of the house up above the roof line and they get rid of it. Um, Mitigation is very effective. If there is, um, typically, if there's a concrete slab, it's pretty easy to handle. It becomes more difficult whenever you have um, crawl spaces or dirt floors. You have to put down something to control that infiltration. Really tough a lot of times when you have, um, like stack stone foundation walls. So um, the limit, 4 picocuries per liter, or I think that's about 4 parts per million. Um, some people lose their absolute minds on this if they go down the rabbit hole on Google. And there are different levels, you can actually treat your water system for radon as well, and that starts getting really expensive. We had to do that once. But radon, pretty common. What's the occurrence in central Pennsylvania? How frequent are you going to come across elevated radon levels? Depending where you are, it's probably about 50-50 chance, right? On-lot sewage. Typically one of the most expensive things to fix on your house. What are the big ones? A well, a roof, foundation, a septic system. And as I described to my clients, anything that you put in the ground for a half a century isn't going to function probably, the way it was designed. So we have septic systems that were installed easily 50 years ago. Is it important to test these? Absolutely. Because what happens if your septic system fails? Well, you may be able to install another septic system. That's why newer, townships have requirements on new lot formations that they must be a lot of times 2 acres or larger. That generally, there's two reasons for that. One, to inhibit, sprawl. Number two, septic systems. You need to be able to treat the sewage. And they want a 2 acre lot because they want to have a primary sewage location and a backup. And both of those have to be 100 feet away from the closest well. So I get very nervous when I see a house that was built in 1950 on a third or a quarter acre lot, because anything that you put in the ground for a half a century or more is probably not going to function as designed. And if you have to put in a new septic system and it has to be 100 feet away from a well, you may not have space on that quarter or third acre lot to accomplish that. Has anybody encountered that situation where they had a failing septic on a tiny lot?
Yes.
And what did you do to fix it?
Well, we terminated. I had the buyer,
Yep.
but what happened was they did take the property. Well, two things. The listing agent then had their own septic company go out, and they said that they could replace it, and it would be about $15,000.
It's not
But they
bad.
took it off the market. They ended up taking the house off the market for like a year, and then they put it back on the market and sold it. But I never really checked to find out what type of system they got. So
Alternative systems include EcoFlow system. It's a little bit smaller, requires less area and less depth, because the old system, a conventional system, takes the effluent from the home into a septic tank where the solids settle to the bottom, the liquids are distributed through the drain field, and the earth acts as a filter, filtering out the nasties before it hits surface water or somebody else's drinking water. Now, sewage standards, sewage treatment standards have increased, over the years, so that now it's more prevalent to have a sand-bound system. What's the importance of the sand? It just adds more filtration on top of the natural soil to make sure that the effluent isn't going too fast or too slow through the soil before it hits a drinking water source. And that sand, they can control the quality of that filtration more than if they're just using the earth. The EcoFlow system uses peat moss or coconut husks also as a filter medium. That requires maintenance um, every several years to make sure that that filter is in good shape. There's other alternative systems that can be employed Sometimes the soil is so rotten that you can't put a sand mound, you can't put an EcoFlow system on it, and you have to get into some other alternative system. There's one that I call a sprinkler system, um, where they treat the fluid in an aerating tank, and then at like 2 in the morning, these little sprinklers pop up and they irrigate the land with that effluent. I would not want to be around there when that happens. But those systems, you know, I've sold a couple of those. There's other called a small stream discharge system. It's like making a um, individual single home sewage treatment plant that discharges into a nearby stream. That takes about a year to install. You have to bring out biologists and hydrologists to make sure that that one's okay, because that one has to go through the state. That one has to go through DEP. Takes a year and about $40,000 to get one of those installed, but it's better than the worst case scenario. And what's the worst case scenario?
Holding tank.
Holding tank. Why is a holding tank the worst case scenario?
Frequently pumped.
Frequently pumped. Um, think of it this way. When we do a hydraulic load test, they're using a 400-gallon quantity to replicate the use of a household over the course of a day. Now, 400 is high. It's probably closer to 150 or 200 gallons, right? Maybe 100 gallons. But still, how big's a holding tank? 2,500 gallons. So you're probably pumping one of these tanks every month, even if you're using it lightly. And, that's several $100s every time you pump that every month for the rest of the time that that home's standing. So that's a big impact on the value of the property. To convert that to real money or actual expense, I do it the same way that I do flood insurance. At today's interest rate of about, let's say, 6%, I think the constant for 6% interest rate is you're about $6.25 per $1,000 you borrow. So if you take $100 divided by say $6, that gives you $16,000 worth of purchasing power for every $100 you add on to monthly expense. So if it cost you $200 to pump that septic tank every month, you could have bought an extra $30,000 in house. So that is the price adjustment that I would apply to a house with a holding tank. Does that make sense? Great. Property and flood insurance. Sound off if you elect this on the regular as a contingency. Nobody?
I have a question about this actually.
Great. Let's talk about it.
My clients are under contract right now. I elected the property and flood insurance. Um, I had them elect that because there's a trailer on the property, and I wanted to make sure that they were able to obtain property insurance because of that extra trailer.
Yep. Good call.
Okay, good.
This is an interesting contingency, and I find it interesting because of the wording. It says the buyer may determine the insurability of the property. This is this is all in the buyer's court. The buyer may determine the insurability of the property by making application for property and casualty insurance for the property to a responsible insurer. No matter what comes back, they could say, that's too much. That's basically a get out of jail free card. So be aware of that.
Yeah, Justin, I always argue that that should not be in there. it should somehow be connected to if they're electing to get a mortgage because can't have one without the other.
Yes, and I follow your logic because on some level, because if the insurance is too high, it could throw off their debt to income ratio and they may not qualify for the mortgage. I think this is important because I first became really aware of this back in 2010, 11, and 12. There was a series of really bad hailstorms that came through our area. Every May, I think it was a May, June, and July for 3 consecutive years, really bad hailstorms hit our area. And um, wasn't so bad in 2010, but in 11 and 12, we started seeing homes that we'd put them under contract. I would use my standard kind of guesstimate as to what insurance coverage would be on my cost sheet. And at the time, for the houses I was selling, it was like $750 a year. And I started getting ones that were coming in at 11, 1200 because there had been hail claims on these properties. Now, on a national scale, insurance companies have been taking a bath. Don't get me wrong, they're still making tons of money. But from California with the wildfires to flooding in New York after multiple hurricanes over multiple years, insurance rates have been skyrocketing. And even as I've adjusted my standard estimate of, $100 a month now, or $150 a month for higher end properties, that's just not covering it. And we're getting some insurance rates that are really off the charts. And what else are we getting? We're getting a lot more repairs that are coming from the insurance agent than we have in the past. Who's had to deal with an insurance agent belly aching about the age of a roof over the past year?
Well, that was kind of more of why I select that if the roof's older,
Yeah.
because they've really been pushing back and denying coverage.
Yes. And now you have to take some bottom rung insurance coverage that cost you an arm and a leg and doesn't really offer any protection. So just to be careful and make sure that your clients have protection, you may want to consider this in situations where you have questions over the life of a roof. If it's not an architectural shingle and it's an old 3-tab, I would figure on that being replaced because nobody's using 3-tab anymore. Those are the flat ones. And I have seen so many roofers or so many insurance agents come out and call for the replacement of roofs that aren't architectural at this point. And then also flood insurance. If you have something that's in the flood zone, if you're using Bright, which I think everybody on today is a uh, Bright area person, you can go and you can see if it's flood zone. It should have been disclosed in the disclosure. It should have been disclosed in the listing. If you want to triple check that, the 360 report through Bright shows if it's in the flood zone. So I encourage you to check on that. Property boundaries. Has anyone ever had any issues with property boundaries?
No.
The buyer may engage the services of a surveyor, title abstractor, or other qualified professional to assess the legal description, certainty and location of boundaries, and or the quantum of land. Is there any other guarantee in this contract over the area of land being transferred? Not really.
I have a question about that. Can you write in the amount of land when you're putting the address in? And then if it doesn't turn out to be that amount, does that give you something to stand on if buyers are upset that the land is not the right amount?
I would say no. I would say use the property boundary.
Okay.
There's no way to really guarantee it other than a survey in most cases,
Okay.
because it's not guaranteed by the deed, it's not guaranteed by the title work. Um, has anyone ever encountered a public tax record that was inaccurate? Yeah, about 10% of the time. Um, I mean, those things are inaccurate kind of on the regular because they're going from historical records and the satellite that everybody kind of counts on. Um, those can be off. They're pretty good, but they're shot from outer space and they're using tax records that are being updated year by year. Some of them haven't been, updated, in the past 50 years because they haven't changed hands. So if you have questions about the area of land, and it says right here, any numerical representation of size of the property are approximate only and may be inaccurate. Keep in mind, the old technology for doing a survey was a rope or a chain with knots or heavy links in it, and they would use that for measuring. Um, the older that equipment was, the more it became stretched. So if the same surveyor was using a chain for 30 years, his surveys might have gotten longer and longer. And in the old days, it ran from the middle of the stream to the stump to the pile of rocks. And that kind of lends itself to a lot of issues when it comes to property boundaries. We had a property that I was involved with. I was hired to sell it. The guys who bought it, they thought they were buying 30 acres. At closing, the old farmer who was selling it says, I'm pretty sure that's closer to 20 acres. And then the realtor breaks out his calculator and starts converting perches to acres and doing some math and says, no, no, that's 30 acres. And they closed. They came to find out later that the farmer's predecessor that he had inherited it from had sold a big chunk to a neighbor and it never got recorded. Did that make that transfer any less legal? No, but it hadn't been recorded on that deed, or a corrective deed hadn't been recorded, so it was inaccurate. This is the space. This property boundary contingency is what's going to guarantee that. And the only way to do that is, you know, um, I would say that the contingency for deeds, restrictions, and zoning and property boundaries can work hand in hand, especially if you're dealing with large mountain tracts or big fields, stuff that's outside of the city. And hey, even if you're in the city, just because there's a fence there doesn't mean that fence was put in the right spot, right? Lead-based paint hazards for disclosure or contingency here. Before the buyer is obligated to purchase a residential dwelling built prior to 1978, the buyer has the option to conduct a risk assessment or an inspection of the property for the presence of lead-based paint or lead-based paint hazards. Regardless of whether this inspection is elected or waived, the Residential Lead-Based Paint Hazard Reduction Act requires a seller of the property built prior to 1978 to provide the buyer with an EPA-approved lead hazards information pamphlet, along with a separate form attached to this agreement disclosing the seller's knowledge of lead-based paint hazards and any lead-based paint records regarding the property. So whose responsibility is it? It's the seller's. So I should probably require that pamphlet be disclosed um, along with that paint disclosure. Has anyone ever had to do a lead-based paint inspection on a property? Nobody? I know this is much more popular in Maryland, especially towards the Baltimore area. There's been a big push down in the Maryland and Baltimore, DC area to limit lead poisoning, especially among tenants in rental housing. I've only ever had to do one lead-based paint inspection in 18 years. It was on the outside of a property because my clients were moving here from Brooklyn, and they had a real problem in their neighborhood where these old apartment buildings that used to have uh, wood siding had all been painted with lead paint, and all the lead paint fell off and into the gardens that were around the foundation of the property. So people would grow tomatoes and food in those gardens at the base of the property, and people were getting lead poisoning. So they were very nervous about that. We had to do a lead inspection for that. So um, those things happen. Other, what might we put in the other section?
A pool,
Well, yeah.
Yeah, you can do a pool. How do you inspect a pool?
call a pool company.
Call the pool company. That's right. I've done them in the winter. Get the guys
Really?
out. Yeah,
Oy.
yeah. They get out there in waders. Good for them. And it's not as expensive as I thought it would be. You could specify if you wanted that you were doing a drive-it inspection, which they notice under D1 down here for the um, exterior building materials. Cindy, didn't you have a go around with drive-it one time, or was it just stucco?
Oh my God. Yeah, I did. Forgot
Yep,
about that.
so did I. Um,
Oy.
Asbestos, that's a fun one, but in my opinion, all of those can be included under the home inspection. Any questions on that stuff before we move down to the actual inspection contingency?
Yeah, I have a question on what you just said.
Okay, go ahead.
You said about what did you just say? Something about that can be handled under the regular home inspection?
It can, but I'm actually not all of them, right? Wetlands, that wouldn't. I would put wetlands under other. Environmental hazards, if they're in the house, that would be okay. I would put environmental hazards outside the house here under other. In
Well,
fact, if I was doing something super special, if it's like a fireplace or a chimney inspection, that falls under the home inspection. But, you know,
well, I know that we had an argument one time at the office between you and another person, and it was about that radon,
yeah,
and it was about the home inspection and this little blip right here.
right.
Because he waived to have a radon. Well, this was just a scenario. They waived a radon test, but then he held the radon test during the home inspection because it was a hazard,
Right. However,
right?
and here was my logic in that, and I think the other person may have been Chris Deerdorf.
I don't
And
know. I'm
and
not
the
saying
other
any other
person
names.
said, because it says here under home inspection, okay, it does specify here interior and exterior plumbing, public sewer systems, heating and cooling systems, water penetration, electromagnetic fields, wetlands and floodplain delineation, structure square footage, mold and other environmental hazards, fungi, indoor air quality, asbestos, underground storage tanks, etc., and any other items the buyer may select. If the buyer elects to have a home inspection of the property as defined in the home inspection law, we already covered that next part. But his logic was that that was, as you stated, a environmental hazard. My point is, or was at the time, that you can't waive specifically a radon inspection and then generally do it, right? Because
Yeah, I
this,
totally agree with you, but I think some agents are a little sneaky. That's all I'm saying. Not that
right,
Chris is sneaky or that Chris was even the one you were arguing with. I'm just saying in general
right, yeah,
that some agents do this kind of stuff.
and they were playing devil's advocate. And my logic on this is you can't generally elect something and specifically waive it at the same time. If it's specifically been waived, you said you're not doing it and you don't have permission to do it. So, inspection contingency. What are the time frames? What are the timelines that you need to think of when you think about the inspection contingency?
10-5-2.
10-5-2. Thank you very much. And which which time frame or time frames can you terminate your buyer's offer?
10-2.
Yes. Right. Very good. Excellent. And what happens if you terminate during the 5? If you have a agent on the other side, um, who is particularly aware of time frames, they may contend um, that you have done it improperly. So during your 10 days, what have you accomplished? You have gone out and you have done your home inspections. You have assessed the results of those home inspection reports, and you have made a written corrective, or, well, you have done one of three things within those 10 days. You have either decided that the inspections elected in 12C are satisfactory to the buyer. You have decided that they are unsatisfactory and you are terminating, or you have decided that they are unsatisfactory and you have submitted a written corrective proposal. That proposal may, but it's not required to, include the name of a properly licensed or qualified professional to perform the corrections requested in the proposal. Provisions for payment, including retests, and a projected date for completion of the corrections. If you have not included the name of a properly licensed or qualified professional to perform the corrections requested in the proposal, does your buyer have a say in who does it?
No.
No. And the buyer agrees that the seller will not be held liable for corrections that do not comply with the mortgage lender or governmental requirements if performed in a workmanlike manner according to the terms of the buyer's proposal. So what's that tell us? We need to be very careful with our language because it may be up to the buyer to make up the difference in that case. I have not encountered that situation yet, knock on wood, but I'm about due for that to happen. I feel it. So, following the end of the contingency period, the buyer has 5 days to do what? Well, we call this the negotiation period. They've got 5 days to consider the offer, maybe do a little bit of legwork on their own, and decide if they're willing to move forward with that. So the buyer and seller will negotiate, and the seller can come back to the buyer, and the buyer and seller can negotiate a different mutually acceptable written agreement, providing for any repairs or improvements. If the seller agrees to satisfy all terms of the buyer's proposal, or the buyer and seller enter into another mutually acceptable written agreement, The buyer accepts the property and agrees to the release in paragraph 28. So, bear with me for a second. We've got a buyer who gives a 14 item catalog of repairs to be made to a seller on day 10. The seller comes back to the buyer and says, I'll do 3 of them. Does the buyer have the right to terminate at that point? No. But at this point, the buyer is irate. I don't even want the stinking house, right? Have we had this happen before? Have we had buyers upset by the seller's response? Sure. Seller comes back and says, all right, I'll do 10 of the items. Buyer says, too late. I don't even want the stinking house. This is day 3 of the seller's response. Buyer says, I want out. No, we can't get out yet. Day 5, the seller comes back and says, fine, I'll fix it all. And they sign the agreement or the proposal that the seller submitted. Does the buyer have the right to terminate? Anybody?
What day are we on now? The 5th?
On the 5th.
No.
Don't they have to wait until the first day of their 2 days?
Well, if the seller agreed,
That's
then
it. If the seller agrees to
Oh, right, the
satisfy
seller
all the
agreed.
terms of the buyer's proposal, then the buyer accepts the property. So there's that. If no mutually acceptable written agreement is reached, or if the seller fails to respond during the negotiation period, then the buyer will either accept the property as is or terminate this agreement. Now, if the buyer and seller do not reach a mutually acceptable written agreement and buyer does not terminate this agreement by written notice to the seller within the time allotted in paragraph 13B3B, the buyer will accept the property and agree to the release in paragraph 28 of this agreement. Ongoing negotiations do not automatically extend the negotiation period. All of that applies unless we're dealing with a septic system and we have a whole different time frame. The seller gets 25 days to come up with a plan to go back to the buyer at that point. And then the buyer has 5 days to consider that. Has anybody had the joy of that experience? Good. I wish you continued luck. So 14, title surveys and costs. Can anybody paraphrase this for me? The buyer has to order title work. It says that the buyer is encouraged to obtain title and owner's title insurance to protect the buyer. If a survey is required to convey clear title, that's the seller's responsibility to pay for that. So the buyer will pay for the title search, title insurance, or any fee for cancellation if the seller is unable to convey clear title.
do they have to do it or can they terminate?
If
Because
the
what if they
se-
don't have the money to do any of those things?
Okay, if the seller can't provide clear title and a title search or a survey would be required, or a lien has to be paid off that they didn't know about. If the seller doesn't do that, then the buyer has to pay them back for their expenses. So the buyer will pay for title search, title insurance, or mechanics lien insurance, or any fee for the cancellation, flood insurance, fire insurance, mine subsidence insurance, or any appraisal fees. Let me read this again here. Buyers encouraged to obtain a buyer shall consult with a title insurance agent. Sorry, that's down here. The property will be conveyed with good and marketable title that is insurable by a reputable title insurance company at the regular rates, free and clear of all liens, encumbrances, and easements, excepting the following: deed restrictions, historic preservation, building restrictions, ordinances, everything that's placed on it by local government, etc. If a change in the seller's financial status affects the seller's ability to convey title to the property on or before settlement date or any extension thereof, the seller has to let the buyer know immediately in writing. A change in financial status includes, but it's not limited to, bankruptcy, foreclosure, judgments, public tax sales, and the seller learning that the sale price of the property is no longer sufficient to satisfy all liens and encumbrances against the property. So it says in G, if the seller is unable to give good and marketable title, everything that the buyer was obligated to pay for up here, flood insurance, fire insurance, hazard insurance, yada, 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 the seller is going to pay them back for
Okay.
anything that they've spent. Okay.
Hmm.
So the buyer may terminate this agreement by written notice to the seller with all deposit monies returned to the buyer, or take such title as they can convey. If title condition precludes the seller from conveying title, the buyer's sole remedy shall be to terminate this agreement. Upon termination, all deposit money shall be returned to the buyer according to the terms, and all the money from paragraphs 14C, 1, 2, and 3, and 14D goes back to the buyer. So 14C, 1, 2, and 3 is title search, inspections, appraisal fees, buyer's customary settlement costs, and accruals, anything that they spent, any surveys that they've paid for. That's all paid back to the buyer if the seller is unable to convey clear title. I had that happen in a situation where the seller bought a property at a tax sale and our buyer's title company wouldn't insure it because of the way that it was conveyed at the tax sale. It was conveyed out of an estate, and all the heirs of the estate hadn't been notified of the tax sale. Because that proper notification wasn't made, there would have been the opportunity for one of the heirs of the estate to come back and claim that property, and our buyers would have been out in the cold. So that's why title insurance is important. Oil, gas, and mineral rights. Has anybody messed with this? I think most of our joiners today are from Central PA South. So we're not very accustomed to these. What this means is that you're not getting the full bundle of sticks. You're not getting the ground rights. You're not getting the mineral rights. You're getting the land. And one of our agents is dealing with this situation right now up in northern PA when it comes to the valuation of a property. There's discrepancies over the value of the property because one party wants to include and one party wants to exclude the mineral rights to the property. And, the mineral rights can be quite valuable. On this property, it amounts to about $500,000.
Hey, Justin, I have a question.
Yep.
So out in Thomasville in York, there's a mine, and that goes for miles underground, underneath a lot of residential area. And I
Yeah.
think also down in, I don't think Lori's on, but also down in Hanover on 94, there's a mine, and there's a new development, which
Really?
they're now starting to have sinkhole insurance required.
Yes.
Um, when I tell people, when somebody sells a house out near a Thomasville mine, for example, I'll say, be careful because you're over the mine. And they argue with me. And my fiance is a commercial electrician that has been down with his truck inside all those roadways under the mine. So,
Wow.
what can we do to protect ourselves here?
I would recommend that your clients elect the property and flood insurance contingency.
Some insurance companies don't even know about it. You didn't expect this one today, did you?
Thank you, Mindy. Um, I would have to say I'm going to have to brush up on my land subsidence area of the seller's property disclosure because that doesn't necessarily have to. What kind of mines are they?
Limestone.
Okay.
When you guys get some more information on this, could you share? Because there's several areas in Hanover that I know have been where there've been sinkholes. Some of them are in departments or developments, some are on the roadways, but there's a lot of that going around in Hanover. So if you ever get some more information on that, if you could share, that'd be awesome.
Um, uh,
Yep, Kim, I didn't see you were on. Yep.
Well, I'm going to have to dig into and see the extent to which line 540, this acknowledgement is made for the purpose of complying with the provisions of Section 14 of the Bituminous Mine Subsidence and Land Conservation Act of April 27, 1966. Because this isn't bituminous, right? This isn't coal mining, but it is still mining. And in central Pennsylvania, especially in the limestone areas like the south side of the Cumberland Valley, um, from Carlisle on down through, that makes for great farmland. Unfortunately, it also makes for it's what they call karst topography because of the limestone. The water gets in there and creates caves with or without mining. So if you're on the south side, the limestone side, not the north side or the shale side, I think that it's a good idea to ask your insurance agent about limes or about sinkholes. Um, yeah, I'm gonna have to dig into this one. Stay
Yeah,
tuned.
Kim, I was talking about the development there across from Tropical Treat. I know they've had some sinkholes there.
Yeah,
Absolutely, they have.
yeah, and this can happen on a grand scale or it can happen on a micro scale. And what often happens, like you've got a downspout going to a buried, um, gutter, that runs out into the yard. It becomes disconnected. And for 10 years or so, you've got every bit of rainwater coming off of that roof, going down there. It creates subsidence and you get a sinkhole out of the deal. And that can happen. It happened up the street from me. We see it every year or two in Palmyra or Hershey, along Route 322 where they shut down because bad stormwater management leads to um, all of that water eroding limestone and creating giant sinkholes. Let me investigate that. That'll be a fun one for another day. Thank you. As far as the bituminous mining, they did something called longwall mining. Up in Northeast PA, it was mostly they were scraping off mountaintops to get to the land. But in Southwest PA and Western PA, They were doing longwall mining and exactly what you're talking about, huge mines that you could drive for hours and hours underneath um, of neighborhoods and streams. And, if one of those supports were to give out after a mine was abandoned, a whole stream could disappear. Wells could run dry or houses could sink. So that's why this is all important. And knowing your market, like if you had somebody from Carlisle come to sell in that neighborhood and being over a mine, they wouldn't know. So it's good to stay in your lane or ask questions.
Yeah, I just don't know how the township approved that neighborhood there. It's crazy. It's brand new.
Is the mine actually under that?
I don't know about that one.
Okay.
There is a mine close further down the road. I would gather to say yes. I'll have to ask Scott.
Yeah, because you said along 94. I'm like, holy crap, I drive over that all the time.
Yeah.
Um,
Yep, don't go the back way because there's definitely sinkholes there between New Oxford and Hanover.
Fun stuff. All right. Notices, assessments, and municipal requirements. This is a really great one that I had a discussion with an agent yesterday and today about. So, in the event that any notices of public or private assessments, as described in paragraph 10F, excluding assessed value, are received after the seller has signed this agreement and before settlement, the seller has 5 days to make notice to the buyer. So, what might that be? That might be they came and they spray painted my sidewalk and told me I had to replace a panel of sidewalk. They might have come and told me that I have to cut down a dead tree. Or they might have said that we're installing sidewalks in this neighborhood this spring. Um,
I had this happen.
yes, yes, you have. So the seller has 5 days to make notice to the buyer and notify the buyer in writing if the seller is going to fully comply or not comply. Then the buyer is going to notify the seller in writing within 5 days that the buyer is either going to comply or terminate. So if the seller complies, the buyer can't back out. If the seller says they're not going to fix it, the buyer has a choice to make. But if the buyer fails to respond within the time stated in paragraph 15A2 or fails to terminate, then the house is theirs as is. Now, this is where we got into it, this other agent and me. We were on the same side of it, but it says if required by law within 30 days from the execution date of this agreement, but in no case 15 days, in no case later than 15 days prior to settlement, the seller will order at the seller's expense a certification from the appropriate municipal departments disclosing notice of any uncorrected violations of zoning, housing, building, safety, or fire ordinances, and or a certificate permitting occupancy of the property. Does anybody have experience with that or know what I'm talking about? I'm dealing with this right now in Manheim Township, Lancaster County. I've dealt with this in Middletown Borough, Dauphin County. In Manheim, they require a occupancy permit of every property that is sold. In Middletown, they require a sidewalk inspection of every property that's sold. In Pembroke Borough, Dauphin County, they come and they check for smoke alarms and I think electric panels. In Monroe Township, Cumberland County, they check for sump pump discharges. And in Shrewsbury Township, anybody know what they inspect for there?
Septic?
Septic. Exactly.
And in New Oxford Borough, they like to come in and look at your water heater for
Yep.
some reason.
For some reason, that's a weird one. So we have the seller. This is upon the seller that they have to figure this out. Now, the township, they require that the septic system in Shrewsbury Township function as designed, correct? And they don't care who fix it, but somebody has to fix it if it doesn't.
Yeah, and it's questionable if they know what they're looking at sometimes.
Of course. Yeah,
I still, as a buyer, I still had my inspection company inspect the septic
I
after
agree.
they left.
Yeah. Yep. So we have our own time frames here, but this is structured very similar to the inspection contingency. Within 5 days of receiving the notice from the municipality, the seller will deliver that copy to the buyer that they are either going to make the required repairs or not make the required repairs. And then the buyer has 5 days to decide if they're going to, accept the property and fix it or terminate the agreement. Now, on to the condo. Condos or planned communities. Is it condos and or planned communities? I've sold 2 properties over the past year that were both condominiums and planned communities. There was 2 associations on each of those. The larger planned community or homeowners association, and then there was a smaller condominium association within that larger HOA. And it was confusing as hell because the seller didn't understand it, the listing agent didn't understand it, and it took me a while to get my head around it because I had 2 sets of HOA docs and yeah, 2 sets of fees. So if you're listing a property, please dig deep and find out what the scenario is. Don't assume it's one or the other because it could be both. All right. There's a whole nother set of hoops to jump through if it's the initial sale of a condo. I'm not going to waste too much time on that yet because unless you get new construction listings in a condo association, if you do come and talk to me, and I'll make sure that you're structuring your public offering statement correctly after I talk to our attorneys and learn how to do that. Following applies to resales of properties that are part of a condo. So within 15 days from you signing the agreement, you or your seller or somebody has to order a certificate of resale and any other documents necessary to enable the seller to comply with the relevant act. The seller will promptly deliver to the buyer all documents received from the association. And the act provides that the buyer may declare the agreement void at any time before they receive those documents and have 5 days to review them after so that they can terminate this deal, potentially if you take the full 15 days to order that and it takes another 10 days according to this to receive them potentially from the association, and then the buyer has 5 days to terminate after receiving them, you could be 30 days into this agreement before a buyer pulls the plug on the deal and your seller has no recourse. Conversely, that could be a get out of jail free card for your buyer because it doesn't state that they have to have any true reason. It's just that they have 5 days to review that documentation. What what relation do real estate taxes and assessed value have on real property values? None. And that is a notice of that. That in Pennsylvania taxing authorities, um, you can appeal the assessed value. Just be aware, if you appeal your assessed value, the property's not guaranteed to go, your assessment's not guaranteed to go down. It could actually go up. Maintenance and risk of loss. Seller will maintain the property uh, in the condition that your buyer made their offer, or the condition it was in when the property went under agreement until closing. Whose responsibility is it if the heat goes out? Seller's responsibility. And if any part of the property included in the sale fails before settlement, the seller is going to either repair or replace that part of the property before settlement, or provide prompt written notice to the buyer of the seller's decision to credit the buyer at settlement for fair market value or not repair it at all. And the buyer gets to decide if they want to keep moving forward. The seller can decide, if there's an insurance claim, or the buyer can decide if there's an insurance claim, if they want it fixed or if they want to take the check and fix it their way. So that's the seller bears the risk of loss from fire or other casualties until settlement. Home warranties I describe as sort of a supplemental insurance program that may provide additional protection for you. If you have interest in those, I can give you that information. Here, sign this waiver that says that you accept or decline. And if you decide that you want to do it later, you can decide to order a home warranty at any time, and I can point you in that same direction. This agreement is not recorded because it would be construed as a lien. That's why we don't record this agreement of sale at the courthouse. And this agreement is binding upon the parties, their heirs, personal representatives, guardians, and successors, and to the extent that it's assignable on the assigns of the parties here too. Buyers will not transfer or assign this agreement without the written consent of the seller unless otherwise stated in this agreement. And assignment may lead to duplicate transfer taxes. I don't encourage assignment without consulting an attorney. We're getting into the real boilerplate of this agreement, right? Like a lot of this stuff, generally, I'm moving through pretty quickly when discussing it with a client. Governing law, if somebody sues somebody, we're going to do this in the court of Pennsylvania. FIRPTA, the Foreign Investment and Real Property Tax Act of 1980. Generally, I've never had a deal where FIRPTA was a concern. Has anyone ever come up against FIRPTA? If you're not a citizen, they can't collect the transfer tax from you. So they may make the buyer responsible for payment of that transfer tax. And we want to make sure that capital gains, not transfer, capital gains. So we want to make sure that everyone's aware of what's going on because we don't want the buyer to get in trouble for it. We want to make sure that that appropriate capital gain is withheld at closing. Notice regarding convicted sex offenders, Megan's Law. If you want to know where the bad guys live, I can point you in the right direction. And then representations. This is I heard it through the grapevine clause. Believe none of what you hear and half of what you see. It's not only your right to inspect the property, but you as a buyer, I feel like it's your responsibility to inspect the property because you're the one who's going to have to live with that decision. Please don't rely on any representations from anyone involved in this other than the professionals that you hire to make sure that this is exactly what you expect it to be. And then a very important part of this whole contract is hidden right here in 25B, unless otherwise stated in this agreement. The buyer has inspected the property, including the fixtures and personal property specifically listed before signing this agreement, or they've waived their right to do so and agrees to purchase the property in its present condition. Man, so many people want to add a provision to this agreement that the property is being sold as is. I would direct you to paragraph 25B, where it's already a part of the agreement. Also, a bit about the standard of repairs to be done. Any repairs required by this agreement will be completed in a workmanlike manner. Brokers have provided or may provide services to assist unrepresented parties in complying with this agreement. They kind of bury that one in there. Default, termination, and return of deposits. This is the, you know, where the buyer terminates this agreement pursuant to any right granted by this agreement. The buyer will be entitled to a return of all deposit monies on account of the purchase price pursuant to the terms of 26B. And this will be void. What that states is, you know, the buyer has the right to terminate about certain things that are, you know, explicitly stated in this agreement. But regardless, here in paragraph B, regardless of the apparent entitlement to deposit monies, Pennsylvania law doesn't allow me as a broker who's holding deposit monies to determine who's entitled to the deposit monies. So no matter what the contract says about who's entitled to it, I can't release it unless there's a two-party written agreement signed that tells me how to direct that money. The rest of this goes on to talk about disputes. I come to this section all the time to figure out what to do when there's a boxing match over who's entitled to deposits. It goes on to say that I won't be liable for distributing it according to the right way or not distributing it, but I will be liable if I disperse it improperly. Seller is limited to retaining those sums paid by the buyer, including deposit monies, as liquidated damages. So what's that mean, guys? That means that it's really hard to figure out how much the actual damages are. So liquidated damages is the legal term for we've all agreed that this is how much money will be at risk in this situation. So if we come to blows and we fight over this, we're going to agree to disagree over the money that's already been collected, nothing else. Can't sue a buyer for breach of contract for $50,000 if they've put up $1,000 as earnest money deposit. But likewise, you can't really go for less either. So, mediation. I know everybody is, you don't have to admit to this, but sound off if you want to, that you've been through mediation.
Been there once.
How did you find it?
Frustrating.
Frustrating. Not as intimidating as
No.
it may have been built up to be.
Nope. I protected a seller from a predatory buyer who concocted a story that the basement, the beautiful finished basement, was a flood zone. And basically what they saw, this was back in 05, 06-ish.
Yeah.
Basically what they saw is she walked away with $150,000 and they wanted it to remodel the basement as they would like to have it.
Oh my goodness.
So I showed up with 8x10 glossy photos of the full finished basement, complete with the daughter's living space and her children, beautiful woodwork, no water staining, no nothing. And I informed them that in this particular case, the seller used all of her funds from this to pay her husband's medical bills, who she had lost to cancer, and that she is residing with her daughter, and there's no blood in the stone. So that was interesting.
Everybody's intimidated by mediation. It's far less intimidating than going to court. And it is the quickest, it is the most cost effective, and it's non-binding. So it's an opportunity for everybody to get together and try and talk it out before things get really ugly. Because mediation isn't ugly. Now, I do appreciate the kind of mystique around it as a level of intimidation to kind of keep everybody behaving. I'm just pulling back the curtain for you guys because you're my agents. It's not all that. Um, is it time consuming? Is it aggravating? Yes. Is it expensive? Not really, not compared to going to court. It's about $400 per party. Um, and it gives everyone a chance to come to the table and try and find a resolution. I've been to, I don't know, 15 of these, and most of them have come to an agreement at mediation. Everybody just wants to get in there and let off steam. If it goes to court, you've gone from $400 to 4,000, pretty quickly. So mediation is just a great way to get in there and kind of talk it out. Release is just kind of like, hey, we're not all liable here. Real estate recovery fund. I describe this to my clients that if you find that you've been taken advantage of by a real estate professional, you take that real estate professional to court. I'm assuming you're going to win because you're good people. That real estate professional then will have a judgment placed against them that they have to pay you some sort of proceeds. If you find then that that shady real estate professional is unable to pay you that judgment, you can take the judgment to the real estate recovery fund. You get twofold satisfaction. They are not allowed to practice real estate until they pay the real estate recovery fund back. At least I think that's how that works. It's been a while since I read the actual fine print on that one. If a buyer is obtaining mortgage financing, the buyer shall promptly deliver to the buyer for broker, if any, a copy of all loan estimates and closing disclosures upon receipt. This just tells everybody what their responsibility is for communication. Wherever this agreement contains a provision that requires or allows communication or delivery to a buyer, that provision shall be satisfied by communication or delivery to the buyer for the broker. If there's no broker for the buyer, those provisions may be satisfied by communication delivery being made directly to the buyer. So that's the agreement. Man, we spent 4.5 hours on this thing. I hope it was valuable to you. Does anybody have any questions on it? Any part of it?
I have a question.
Go ahead.
In the deed restrictions and zoning contingency, what would it look like as an agent to help your client with the next step after you elect that?
Typically, you're going to order, and I had this exact situation. One of our agents had a property listed. The seller disclosed that there was an easement on the north side of the property, 50 feet along the north property line. The buyer's agent even called our agent about that disclosure of that easement. They elected the zoning and restrictions contingency, and then they didn't do anything with it. Then they tried to terminate the deal when the title search came back. What they should have done was order that title search on day one and talk to their title abstract company or their attorney and say, this deal is contingent upon me knowing more information about that easement. Make sure I get this title report within the next, put a rush on it. Get it to me in 5 days because we have 10 days. So that's typically how I would address that. Depending on the nature of it, give me a call if you find yourself in a situation where you want to know more. I'm probably going to advise you, call the title company, put a rush on that title search. You might want to talk to a surveyor or, we'll just talk about it at that point. But usually that's satisfied by a title search.
Okay.
Is that it?
Well, that's all I had.
All right, great. All right. Anybody else? I guess I put you all to sleep, except for Jessica, Shelley, and Susan. I appreciate you all. Thanks, Brandy. See you
Thank
all.
you.
Thank
Thank
you.
See you, Mindy.
Thank you.
Appreciate you guys.
Thank
Thanks
you.
very much. Hey, what should we what are we
Bye,
covering
guys.
next month? Is there anything that you're dying for me to bore you on? Seller's property disclosures, that's always a hot one.
Hmm.
Escalation clauses are always clear as mud sometimes.
I like that.
True.
Well, how about escalations and the new appraisal contingency and how they relate?
Yeah.
Okay.
Sounds good.
Oh, that sounds super fun. All right.
And the waiver.
Yeah. All right. Great. Thanks, Mindy.
Thank you,
Again.
Justin.
Let me dig into the Hanover mines.
Okay, and Scott came through the dining room here while I was on, and he said the mine on 94 just goes under the road from one side to the other. So what's causing the sinkholes there across from the restaurant? Who knows? It could just be limestone.
Well, yeah, it's
What you said.
limestone. It's limestone, and all that water's coming down and eroding that and making natural caves.
Yep.
That's it.
All
Awesome.
right. Sorry to be long-winded. I
You're all
just had
good.
that on my mind.
Appreciate you guys. Have a great one.
You
Bye.
too. Thank you.
You
See
guys.
ya.